One of the things that I love about Nate is we were talking one day in terms of how do we help laborers continue to labor, and how do we kind of dust off the cobwebs, so to speak. And one of the phrases that he used was, he would say, if the DNA is in there, it will come back out. And so in some ways, what we hope is true is that you are being discipled right where you're at, and you're learning to disciple right where you're at. And that gets Jesus DNA in you. And when that DNA is in you, even if there's challenging seasons or life is crazy or you might have challenges, you can't help but be a disciple maker that Jesus has called you to do. Hey friends, it's officially 2025. I'm here with Andrew once again to celebrate what God did in 2024, but also to look ahead in the year 2025. We have been praying for you. We've been praying for the ministry of the End of the Harvest. So most of all, we've been praying that God would advance his kingdom through like-minded disciple makers who take the message of Jesus, who live out his methods to proclaim who Jesus is and what he has for this world. So, Andrew, it's been an awesome year, 2024, as we look back. We've had a whole bunch of different projects we worked on. But, man, I just wanted to give you a chance just to reflect on what God did in 2024.
You're right. It has been, it's always crazy. Like I'm in my 50s now, and it never changes where you get to the end of a year. And, of course, it's just a date on a calendar, but it's a great opportunity to reflect back on all the ways that you've seen God at work in your life and in your local area and in a ministry like Into the Harvest. And it is pretty overwhelming, actually, to think back at all that has happened this past year and all of the ways that God's faithfulness has shown up. So I think December has been a great month for us just to take stock, to take inventory of what God has done. This has been a great year for Into the Harvest. And as we look at 2025, like you said, we're going to talk a little bit about why this ministry exists and what we hope to see God do in the coming year. But yeah, we definitely don't want to just rush into the next year without taking a moment just to express gratitude to the Lord for his faithfulness and to everyone who's part of this community, regardless of where you're at in the world. It's a real joy just to be a part of this and to be working alongside you in the kingdom.
Andrew, it's so true that God is faithful, and so often we actually lose these opportunities, or we don't take advantage of the opportunities we have to reflect on his goodness. You and Shelton earlier this year did a great episode on gratitude for Thanksgiving, and one of my thoughts that came out of that is if we don't sit down and really think about what God has done, we're very quick to be thinking about, I'm missing out on something, or I wish God had done something differently, instead of or maybe even complaining, God, why didn't you do this? But what gratitude and what this season could do and should do for each of us is just help us remember, man, God was so good, and he's done some miraculous things in our midst. And, one of those things for us is that we've had a year-end giving project that we've really been trusting the Lord for over the last really kind of 4 to 6 weeks. And we saw God do more than we thought, more than we even asked him to do, if we're completely honest. And you guys were were very much a part of that as our listeners and as our supporters. And so we just want to stop and say thank you to you who gave and those who prayed for our giving project. You really do make this ministry a possibility, and God has worked through you to really bless the work and provide financially for it. So we wanted to stop and say thank you to you, but also to recognize that all giving comes from God, and we're thankful for how he has blessed the work of Into the Harvest. So, Andrew, you got some thoughts on that, comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a nonprofit ministry, but there are resources required to produce it and to make it possible, and we're listener supported. So the folks that are part of this ministry, by listening and learning from what we're doing here at Into the Harvest, when you guys give, it makes it possible for us to keep going. So like John said, very grateful for the year-end giving. Many of you support the ministry on a monthly basis, and just want to say thank you to all of you for partnering with us and making Into the Harvest possible.
Yeah, so as we look forward to season 8, Andrew, we've got a great season planned. We just spent a few days together at the beginning of December to really pray through how God would have us focus on season 8, what he'd had for us and who we'd want to have on the show that we think would really help people make disciples, be a disciple, make disciples in the harvest. Really, all of that being focused on helping everyday believers live as disciples and make disciples. So you got some highlights that you're thinking about or ways we want to think about season 8 for our listeners today?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's crazy to think that we are going into season 8. I never would have imagined when we started this ministry back in 2015 that it would develop the way that it has. And the Lord has definitely been the one guiding that each step of the way. So excited about kicking off season 8 of this show. I think Into the Harvest as a podcast it's unique. I truly believe that in the podcast world, there's a lot of great ministries, great podcasts, great YouTube channels that are focused on serving God's people. Every so often, we try to reintroduce why this channel exists, why we're making these videos, because I do see it as being unique in terms of what I've come across that's out there. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about that. I think it's been about a year since we did one of these shows, John, where we just kind of reintroduced the mission of Into the Harvest, why it exists. For those of you who are new to the channel, hopefully today will be just a good summary of why we're here and what we're trying to do. And we actually do have a mission statement. We have a vision of what we're trying to accomplish. That's a living document, so it gets updated. I would say that it doesn't really change. It just gets refined, or at least that's been the experience so far. So why don't we do that, John? Maybe we can actually read through our mission as Into the Harvest so that folks know exactly what we're trying to accomplish and what we're trusting God for. And then we can finish up just by talking a little bit about why we think that mission is so important and why we're so passionate about it. I can read through this, and then we can just kind of discuss different aspects of it. So, first of all, Into the Harvest is a media ministry that inspires, educates, and resources disciple makers. So our mission is to help ordinary believers live and share their faith in the everyday places of life. And we're focused on producing digital content that inspires and brings clarity to disciple makers. We also provide print materials and online resources to help disciple makers grow in their faith and share it with others. What we really want is to help people focus on Jesus and get involved in his work. So everything we do serves to highlight the Master, his message, and his mission. Into the Harvest serves within the larger community of God's people, and we seek to leverage technology and media to encourage and equip a new generation of disciple makers. So that, in a nutshell, is why we exist and what we're trying to accomplish. John, before we started recording, you and I just touched on a few highlights from those short paragraphs. And the first one is that we exist to inspire, educate, and resource disciple makers. And I actually think that's one of the things that is unique about this podcast and this ministry.
Yeah, we really want, if you are a disciple maker, or you want to be a disciple maker, we want to communicate to you, this is your channel. You are our target audience. In fact, if that's something that you're really interested in growing in 2025, we just encourage you to like and subscribe, because everything that we're going to do on this channel is going to be focused on you and on your journey for your disciple making to look like Jesus' disciple making. And everything that we teach, whether we're talking about church or we're talking about how to do Bible study, or we're talking about the ideas of what it looks like to labor in the kingdom, or any principle that we're talking about, it's always going to kind of come from that disciple making worldview. So there's very few things that we'll do or we'll engage in where we're not thinking about, well, how did Jesus make disciples? And if I'm going to teach discipleship, how does this resemble what Jesus did with his disciples? So we really want this story, this channel, these lessons, these podcasts, the emails that we'll send this year to really help you hone in your disciple making in 2025.
Yeah, I always come back to live and share your faith. That's what we're trying to help you do, to live it out in everyday life and to share it in everyday places. And that really is at the heart of being a disciple and making disciples. So even when we do deep dive book studies, like we went through the book of Titus last year on this podcast, we went through the book of First Thessalonians, we're coming at it from that practical lens, which, yes, there's theology, there's truths that we need to understand and allow to shape our convictions. But then how do we live this out? Like, how does this change the way that I live my daily life? And how does it inform the way that I share that faith with others? And that's really what it means to be a disciple maker. So even if you're just getting started in your faith, you're just getting started as a follower of Jesus, this is where he wants to take you. We believe that the default setting for all Christians should be to grow to maturity in their faith and to know how to share it with others, to become a disciple maker. So we see this with Jesus and his first disciples. The very first thing that he says in his initial call and invitation to them is, "Come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." So if you're listening to this channel, that's always going to be our intent, is to help you follow Jesus so that you can begin to live for him and share him with others. We are focused on disciple makers, John, but we're not focused on experts, so to speak. And that really is the second part of that initial paragraph, right?
Yeah. So if you feel overwhelmed with the task of making disciple, thinking, well, what do I have to give away? Or how do I do that? Or what's the process? Or surely I have to get a degree, or whatever it may be. We want to help ordinary believers. This channel's for you. We want you to feel like I have lessons that God's taught me, and we want to help you learn how to give those things away with confidence, clarity, and with conviction. So our hope is that this would be a very layman's focused channel, that you wouldn't feel overwhelmed by super theological words or very kind of crazy concepts that are really hard to get your hands on. We really hope it's practical. So, and we really believe that's what Jesus did, that Jesus really selected ordinary people that were going to push the kingdom forward after he was gone, and it worked. So regardless of whether you think that was the right strategy or not, we're here talking about Jesus 2,000 some odd years later because of his strategy. And his strategy was ordinary people who live out their lives with Jesus at the focus, and in everyday places that they went, where they worked, where they lived, where they played, in the neighborhoods. So that's really at the heart for us, that we want you as an ordinary believer. And we believe that's the way the kingdom advances, that it won't necessarily be on the backs of trained professionals, but instead it'll really be pushed forward as everyday ordinary people really live their faith in a very practical way, and they share that everywhere they go.
Yeah, and even though that's true, it doesn't just happen by default. So even though that's the Lord's purpose for each of us as ordinary people, he wants us to become mature followers and disciple makers, but that does not just happen. And that's, again, why this show exists, is because we want to bring inspiration, clarity, and resources to you as you're growing in your faith and learning to share it with others, because some of the things that are the greatest obstacles to disciple making in a modern culture like ours are things like distraction, discouragement, isolation. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to be trying to help you overcome as you follow Jesus and serve him. So if you're an ordinary believer, it's perfect, because you're the exact type of person that the Lord has always called to follow him and share him with others. And we just want to help you grow and be resourced so that you can do that more effectively. The last thing I wanted to really point people to, and we've already touched on it a few times, John, but it's to have a focus on Jesus.
Yeah, this one, you really feel like you shouldn't have to mention this, but you have to mention this. So in fact, we had a YouTube short on this earlier this year, and someone said, "Are you crazy? How is Jesus this lost figure?" And they just couldn't wrap their minds around that Jesus was kind of lost in all of the conversation. But here's what's scary, is that it's very hard to keep the main thing, and Jesus is the main thing. He's the master. It's his message, and it's his mission. But most of all, what we feel like is lost is his method. We're always chasing something else instead of the way Jesus did. And I had Justin Gravitt on the show earlier this year. And one of the questions that I'm just dying to ask him is, why is it that we hate the tactics of Jesus? Like, why is it that we're so quickly kind of moved on to, maybe a passage from the Old Testament that kind of gets famous and there's a book, and then we're like locked in on this particular prayer of somebody, or
we're focused on like business methods, like, hey, what's working in corporate America? Let's bring that into the church, and that's how we're really going to turbocharge the growth of God's kingdom. But I don't think it works that way.
No, yeah, one of my favorite quotes this year that I got from Bobby Harrington, who leads discipleship.org, is that we tend to think that good preaching, good praise and worship, and good programs make disciples. And I have to credit him because I've worn that phrase out. And really what makes disciples is focusing on Jesus's method. He's the master. It's his message. It's his mission, and we have to use his method. So you may feel like we're beating a drum that everybody's like, yeah, I totally get it. It's about Jesus. You're exactly right. It is about Jesus, but we have to say it over and over again because Satan he's clever. His tactics is to push us away from the message and the methods and the mission of Jesus, because he wants us to serve him as master instead of Jesus.
We've said this before. I think a lot of times people, they agree, like, yeah, it's all about Jesus. Jesus is at the heart of Christianity and the Christian faith. But there's always that but. And I think that's part of our challenge, is that sometimes we start with Jesus, but then we move on from him and we get caught up into other things, whether it's methods or other topics that we think are especially important in our society and culture at the moment. And one thing that we will always be trying to do is bring you back to a focus on Jesus, because when your life is lived focused on Jesus, oftentimes what it does is it puts those other things in perspective in a way that if you're just trying to stand and look at culture or look at the world today and figure out like, what's the greatest need? What do I need to be giving my life to? When Jesus is not in the crosshairs of your focus, I mean, it could be, and this happens all the time. You see this on social media with Christians. Like next month, they're going to be, focused on something totally different than they are this month because there's some new great threat that has to be addressed by God's people. Whereas if we can just focus on Jesus and learn to grow in a deeper devotion to him, these other challenges that are going to come our way in 2025, we'll find out that those things get put in perspective, and we'll determine that there are some battles that they're not ours to fight. Jesus lived his life on the earth, and there were lots of things happening in his day and age as well, lots of injustices, lots of problems. But Jesus knew what his mission was from the Father, and there were certain fights that were not his to fight. And so I don't think we're going to have that wisdom to discern what is it that God is really calling us to do unless we focus on Jesus and stay close to him. So that will always be what we're trying to do here, is focus on Jesus as the master, his message and his mission. And like you said, his methods, John.
Yep. So I think what would be really fun, Andrew, is if we actually kind of just take a look at our master production schedule and just kind of highlight some of the folks that are coming on the show this year. So folks that there'll be some usual suspects, so to speak, some of our favorite folks who come on the show and really bring a lot of energy, but bring a whole bunch of clarity to who Jesus is, what Jesus wants from us. So obviously we're going to talk about, we'll be on the show a number of times this year. I got us three shows here right out of the gate, pretty quick in January, but then also in March. But we'll also have a man named Marcus Warner on the show who helps lead a ministry called Deeper Walk. And he'll come on the show to actually talk about what's it look like to do things above behavior modification and just Christian activities. How do we actually get to the heart of following Jesus? We'll have some local laborers on the show, a young man named Levi who's been a part of our ministry here. in the Fort Liberty, Fayetteville area, who's just kind of what's church in the harvest looked like for him. Brad Briscoe will come back on the show. He always brings us this great missional perspective on what's it look like to be on mission. So Andrew, how about some other ones that you might want to highlight as we kind of look towards season 8?
Well, you mentioned Bobby Harrington. We're hoping he'll be able to join us. Again, he's the founder of discipleship.org, which is a great ministry that we partner alongside. It has a very, very similar mission to Into the Harvest. Also, Renee Sproles, who has been on a few times, very gifted communicator and disciple maker out of Middle Tennessee. Susie Walther, who's one of the most gifted and accomplished disciple makers that I personally know, is going to be joining us from Tampa, Florida. So yeah, that's just the first 3 months. But yeah, we're hoping to continue to have great guests coming on. Another one that has been on once before, but we're going to have again, is Ian Harbour. He is an author out of Texas who just wrote a book on deconstruction, which I think is very relevant to some of the challenges that this generation is facing when it comes to making sense of not just the world and the culture that they're part of, but how does Christianity fit in? How does this ancient faith make sense in a modern world? So he's also someone that will be coming on here later in January.
Yeah, we'll also have Alan Chang, who is one of the international leaders of the Navigators. And what we hope to really learn from him is, I actually had a chance to travel to a couple different countries with him to specifically talk about what does church around the world look like, and how do we live out the principles of church in our context and let the Bible be our guide. So it's biblical, but it's also relevant to the people. I almost hate to use that word, but it's also relevant to the people in that culture of the day. And if you love or hate our Walking Through the Bible series, and some of you, we get mixed reviews on those on the show in terms of viewership. We're going to have Heidi join us. She's been on the show before. Heidi's going to join us, and we're going to walk through the book of 1 Corinthians together in April and May. So be looking forward to that. I can't tell you how excited I am for that. You'll get to see Andrew and I geek out again on the scriptures. And I know you'll love the insights that Heidi brings as she studies with us, alongside us, and that. So we're really excited about that.
Many of you have met Heidi, and you also get emails from her each week. She is part of our Into the Harvest team. She helps us with our social media, but she's also a follower of Jesus, a student of the scriptures. So it's going to be fun having her join John and I as we do a deep dive on 1 Corinthians. I think most people like the deep dive studies that we've done on the scriptures. But if you don't, I'm sorry, because we love it. We love to study the scriptures and then share it together as a community. And I absolutely love 1 Corinthians. I think it's one of the most unique letters in the New Testament. It's like the opposite of Romans. You know, Romans is this very polished, this very expert presentation of the gospel in its doctrinal form. And Corinthians is this really messy, gritty book about how the gospel actually works itself out in a flawed community, which is what, we need both. We need to kind of like study the gospel in this laboratory setting so that we understand all of its truths and principles. But then we also need to figure out, my community is a very broken community. How do I actually share this? How do I make disciples with a group of messed up people who look like me or messed up like me and need this message? So I'm really excited about 1 Corinthians. Like you said, John, we're going to be diving into that later this year in April. It'll probably carry us into May as well. Something that folks can expect here in 2025 is we are going to have a recurring theme. Last year, it was really the scriptures and growing in your commitment and understanding of the scriptures. This year, it's going to be church, having a biblical understanding of what the church is, what it means to be part of it, how to serve to build it. So those are going to be topics and conversations that we have throughout the year as we're talking with guests or as John and I are doing shows. It's not going to be the only thing we talk about, but it will be a recurring theme that we focus on here in 2025. So I'm excited about that as well, just growing in my own study of the church, but also hopefully helping those who are part of this listening community grow as well.
Yeah, we'll talk about that more next week as we kind of zoom in on church and why we think that's such an important topic. But want to give you that heads up. If church is something that you're wanting to understand more, or you feel like needs to be like clearer in the ways you think about God and you're involved in the kingdom, then this should be a great year. 2025 and season 8 will be a great year for you. So Andrew, we've kind of just talked about our white paper. We've talked about season 7. We're kind of all over the map here, which is really good. Hopefully you can hear our excitement because we can't wait to do this with you this year. What do you think success looks like for ITH?
Man, success for ITH. I think if we follow through with what we just talked about, that would be success, man. So I would say I always think of this both internal and external. I think internally, you and I and our teammates here on Into the Harvest, we want to stay focused on Jesus. We want to be ordinary believers who are living for him and sharing him with others in our local areas. We are disciple makers. So we're doing this in our own personal lives and in our own local areas. Into the Harvest is just a chance for us to share this with a broader community and encourage God's people outside of our local areas. So I always think that success level 1 is just living it. If we stop doing the podcasts next week, we could still be successful because success is really following Jesus and living for him in your personal life. So I think that's kind of like from an internal point of view, like you said, the main thing is to keep the main thing. And if we do that in our personal lives and as teammates at Into the Harvest, that's going to be successful. But of course, we're making content and we're putting it out there into the world. And so I think success for us this coming year is going to be to produce videos and our written content, the blogs that we're doing this year, that point people to Jesus and build up the church. I actually do think that is the number one definition of success, if we use that word. I'm not sure that's the best word, but it's one that we're familiar with. I was reading today Paul's words to the Galatians church, and he talked about being in the pains of labor with them until Christ was formed in them. And Paul was always trying to build up the church, to build up other believers. And so that was success. Success was if he could help people focus their lives on Jesus and if he could build them up in their faith. So I'm anticipating this is going to be a really full year for us. We've got a lot of shows planned, a lot of videos. We just launched the Pathway series, which are books that you can get on Amazon, which will help you follow Jesus and share him with others. We're hoping to make those available to more people here in 2025. So there's definitely a lot of work that's going to be happening throughout 2025. I think success will be if we can the result of that work is people being more focused on Jesus, being more encouraged, built up, and mature in their faith. That would be success for me. That might be too abstract, John, so let me throw it back to you. Anything that you would add to that might bring some more fine-tuning to it?
Well, maybe we should use a different word. What does faithfulness look like in 2025? I don't know, but I do think success is something that kind of rings in everyone's ears. I wondered if, obviously the scriptures is something we always constantly want to be going back to. And Paul, when he's in prison, he doesn't just like pack it in. He's like, well, I'm supposed to be out there, leading people to Jesus and kind of launching churches. Well, now I'm in prison, so I guess that's over. In some ways, I think it kind of helps clarify what success might look like for us as using Paul as a model. So I just had a couple passages in the book of Ephesians that I think highlights 4 things that he did that we can kind of model off of. So he prayed for the people, he reminded the people, he charged the people, and he warned the people. And the first one is in chapter 1 of Ephesians, verses 16 through 19. And he says, I do not cease to give thanks for you, remembering you in my prayers, that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you the spirit of wisdom and of revelation in the knowledge of him, having the eyes of your hearts enlightened, that you may know what is the hope to which he has called you, What are the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints? And what is the immeasurable greatness of his power towards us who believe, according to the working of his great might? And the passage goes on, and it's an amazing passage. And I want you to hear that prayer. What is the hope to which you've been called? What are the riches of his glorious inheritance? And what is the immeasurable greatness of his power towards us who believe, according to the working of his grace? It's just amazing things. He's not just asking them to kind of survive, He's asking that they would understand Jesus and all of his fullness and all of his goodness. So then he actually then goes on to remind them. He reminds them of the depth of the gospel. This is chapter 2. Verses 1 through 5, and he says, "And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked. You followed the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. That's among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh." So he really highlights and helps them remember the gospel and the power and the truth of the gospel. He talks to them about unity in chapter 2, verse 13. "But now in Christ Jesus, you who were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. He himself is our peace. He's made us both one and has broken down in this flesh the dividing wall of hostility." It's just beautiful, beautiful words here. "In him," this is verse 22, "in him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Holy Spirit." So he's reminding them of the unity they ought to true. And then he, in verse 10 of chapter 3, he says, "So that through the church the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places." What is the role of the church? What is it supposed to do? Make known these mysteries that everybody's been wanting, everybody's been needing, and everybody's been hungering for. And then in chapter 4, verses 1 through 7, he charges them. He kind of almost in 1 through 3, almost everybody who studied Ephesians sees these are what true of you in 1, 2, and 3. And then chapter 4, 5, and 6, he's like, do this, like get after it. There's some things that I need you to do because of these truths. And chapter 4, verse 1, he charges them. He says, "I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There's one body, one Spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God." So he charges them to live in a worthy manner, to walk in a worthy manner. And then chapter 5, all the way through chapter 6, halfway through chapter 6, obviously we won't read all of those passages. He says, walk in love and be faithful to the roles. He's continually going through. And then the last thing he does is he warns them. So he charges them to walk in a manner worthy, and then he charges them to walk in love and faithful roles. Then he warns them in 6:10 through 12. He says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you might be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over his present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." So I think in terms of what faithfulness looks like, we can do those same things. We want you to know that we pray for you consistently. When we see comments on the thread, when we get a chance to see you respond back on emails, when we're via text talking about the show and you're asking questions, we're praying for you. And not just that you'd be okay, and not that you'd continue, but instead that you would thrive and know the fullness of God. And we want to remind you. We want to be reminded ourselves. We want to remind you as well. We do want to charge you to live your life, to walk in a manner worthy, and to walk in love, and to walk in faithfulness in the roles that God's given you. But we're also going to warn you, like it's easy to get your focus off Jesus. It's easy to kind of give your life to something less than the fullness of Jesus that he's called you for. So I think that's what faithfulness looks like. I think Paul's a great example of that. He just doesn't like say, well, I can't be everywhere. I'm stuck in prison, so I won't do anything. But instead, he leverages the technology that God gave him in the day to be present and to really challenge and exhort people to continue to stay strong in Christ.
Yeah, I love that, man. Even though it was a quick run through Ephesians, I mean, the things that stood out to me as you were sharing that, like you said, here is Paul doing everything that he can while he is limited physically, like he cannot leave prison. And in a sense, like we can't be physically present with the people that are listening to this podcast in most cases. But what we can do, John, like you said, is pray for them, point them to Jesus. And like we started out talking about earlier, hopefully bring them that encouragement and the inspiration to stay focused on him, but also some clarity on ways of how to do that, which is what Paul is constantly doing, whether it's in letters to the Ephesians or the one that we looked at a few months back in 1 Thessalonians. We see a very similar pattern where Paul there, he can't be with them physically, but he's doing everything he can to encourage them and to help them be strengthened. But that really kind of brings us to the limits of this kind of ministry. And again, it loops back to why we're focused on disciple makers, because there is only so much that you can do through a YouTube channel or through a podcast. And one of the challenges I think I see the modern church facing is that we've got these great communicators who are on platforms like YouTube, who are teaching the scripture, and people are learning from them, whether that's, people like the Bible Project or, people like Bishop Barron or Mike Winger. There's so many great resources available to God's people. But there's only so much you can do from a distance. There's only so much you can do through a YouTube channel. So we truly believe that the heart of God's work in the world today is through local disciple makers. So the heart of what ITH is going to accomplish is not going to be through our direct ministry. It's going to be through encouraging disciple makers to live this out in their local area. And I know we chatted just a little bit in our notes about some examples of that from our own personal experience. So I'll turn it over to you, John, and see what you want to share with us on that.
Yeah, we've talked about a good mutual friend of ours, a guy named Nate Bowers, numerous times on this podcast. We have to have him on this year. So spoiler alert, we're going to ask him. I don't know if he'll jump on, but we'd love to have Nate on the show. And many of you who are disciple makers that kind of grew up in the same community, Nate. But one of the things that I love about Nate is we were talking one day in terms of how do we help laborers continue to labor, and how do we kind of dust off the cobwebs, so to speak. And one of the phrases that he used was, he would say, if the DNA is in there, it will come back out. And so in some ways, what we hope is true is that you are being discipled right where you're at, and you're learning to disciple right where you're at. And that gets Jesus DNA in you. And when that DNA is in you, even if there's challenging seasons or life is crazy or you might have challenges, you can't help but be a disciple maker that Jesus has called you to do. And so what we hope this channel does, what we think it can do, is to help you keep the DNA fresh, keep the DNA at front of mind, and it not be something that's easily lost or forgotten, or help you right size what being faithful looks like in the season that you're in, so that the DNA of Jesus is something that you live out of every day. And so I really like Nate's phrase there, if the DNA is in there, it'll come back out. And I've seen that over and over and over again as folks have transitioned from season to season. They were involved in either your ministry or our local ministry here, or ministry that we had together. And as soon as the circumstances of their life changes and there's more availability and lots of military folks, they're not underway or they're not deployed. Oh, let's do this. I can't wait to go hit the streets again and share my faith and find the next generation of believer that comes up. So I think that story really helps me remember how to be faithful in this season, and it kind of informs what ITH can do. So it's going to be very hard for us to implant Jesus DNA into you off the kind of through the interwebs and kind of an article or a blog or even our Pathway series. We can help you kind of begin to taste some of that DNA, but all of that will actually happen locally.
Yeah, this is going to be probably a terrible analogy, but one of
good
the
start, Andrew.
One of the YouTube channels that my wife Cindy and I sometimes enjoy watching is called Tasting History. Dude, great channel. Totally off topic. But what this guy does is he goes back through like ancient books and finds recipes, and then he'll try to make cornbread from the 1500s or something, right? And it's this great combination of like, he's actually trying to make the food, but he's also giving you a history of why this food was popular and like how it's come down to us. Well, I think you can just watch a channel like that and enjoy it. You can just consume it. And, I know that that's true for Christian channels as well. People can just listen to it and enjoy it and be encouraged by it and consume it. So that would be not success for us. Like if you're just like listening to the podcast or watching the videos with Into the Harvest, it really is not what we're trying to do. Like, we're not just trying to put out content that people are encouraged by, and that's it. We actually want you, like, we're sharing with you the recipes, so to speak, that we've learned over the years and that we're living out right now, because the goal is for all of God's people to be making those recipes, to actually be making disciples and living it out in your local area. And so, if that's happening, if people are being encouraged by what they're learning with Into the Harvest, and then the real adventure is when you turn around and try to live it. When you're trying to live it, when you're praying and trusting God in your local area, when you're asking him to show you who are the people that you want me to reach out to, that's where this channel is really going to give you the most benefit, is practical insights on how to do that and how to live that out. So that's going to be our goal in 2025. And I hope that whatever comes out on the podcast or on YouTube or at our website helps you become more effective at following Jesus and sharing him with others this coming year. So, John, any final thoughts from you as we kind of wrap up this first show?
Yeah, I just think that as we think about 2025, we want it to be about the Master. We want it to be about Jesus. We want it to be about his message, his mission, and his method. And we hope that everything you hear from us is about Jesus first, and it has a discipleship focus. But the last thing I'd just love to say, Andrew, that I think is really important, is we want to do this with you. We don't want to do this in front of you. So many of you have liked and subscribed and you've made comments, but feel free to reach out, feel free to comment, ask questions on our YouTube channels, use our email. If you'd like to email either one of us, please use that. We'll put that kind of info at intotheharvest.org. We'll put that in the show notes so you can click there, ask questions. We've already had people from all over the world actually message in and ask about resources being available in different languages, or how does this work? Or we had someone actually talk about what's it look like to define the relationship that hasn't gone well for me this year. So we want to do this with you, not in front of you. So feel free, and please do like, subscribe, comment, and ask questions. We want to interact with you. And we want to be a place where you're not just interacting with Andrew and I or Heidi or some of our other content developers, but you're actually also interacting with each other. Well, I've seen this happen. Well, this is what works for me. So by liking and subscribing, you get to see all of those comments, and you can then kind of give what God's taught you through the years. So we truly can be a community that supports and helps each other as we all trying to seek to be a disciple, make disciples in every nook and cranny of the harvest.
Man, I just second that 100%. Like this, I'm excited about this coming year, 2025. If you're still listening at this point in the podcast, yes, leave a comment, email us. There's no reason why this community can't grow, and we want whatever we're doing here in the coming weeks to be something that's relevant and helpful for you. So if you let us know what you're up against, the challenges that you're facing, it's going to help us be more effective at sharing with you about following Jesus. So, John, I'm excited about 2025. Next week, folks, we're actually going to start that focus on the church. So we'll be talking about what is the church, and we'll have some free resources that you can use to grow in your understanding and convictions on that topic. So like John said, stay tuned, and we'll see you guys next week.